certainly a lot of conflict in the world is driven by the feeling of injustice, right? We've been, as a group or as a country, we feel we've been treated badly and we've been treated unfairly, and now it's time to kind of object to that.
Welcome to Split Decision, the Decision Science podcast. So, you want to know more about your own decisions and perhaps the choices of those around you? Well then, this is the podcast for you. I'm Sarah Vahed, and I'm happy to welcome you to this very first episode of our show, where we sit down with experts across academia, policy, and practice to help you stay informed on the latest in everything decision science. But what exactly is decision science? What can it teach us about ourselves and the world? What even is the Radboud Center for Decision Science? Well, today we go straight to the source, to our Center Director, Professor Alan Sanfey, to help us get answers to these questions and a whole lot more. In addition to his role as Center Director and also co-host of future episodes of this show, Alan Sanfey is Professor of Decision Neuroscience at Donders Institute for Brain, Cognition and Behavior in the Netherlands. By combining behavioral experiments, brain imaging and formal economic models, Professor Sanfey's work tries to help us understand important concepts that shape our world, like unfairness and inequality. Over the course of this episode, he tells us more about that. And he might even share a few tips that both individuals and policymakers can benefit from the next time they're treated unfairly. To learn more about him, visit our website at centerfordecisionscience.nl and follow his lab at decisionneuroScienceLab.com. Firstly, Alan, welcome to Split Decision. It's good to speak to you today.
It's nice to talk to you, Sarah.
And today's episode is a particularly special one because this is the very first episode of this podcast in which both Alan and I speak to experts working in the field of decision science. Before the listeners hear you, Alan, in your capacity as host, today you are in the hot seat as the very first guest. So my very first question to you is, to those that do not know anything about it, what is decision science and what are the goals of those people that are working in this field?
Well, thanks for having me here, Sarah. So the way I think of decision science is essentially trying to empirically investigate decision making. And what I mean by that is seeing, are there common principles and mechanisms and processes we use to make our decisions and choices? Obviously, we make many, many decisions every day, and they range from the astoundingly trivial, like what am I going to have on my sandwich for lunch, or what socks am I going to put on this morning, up into the very, very consequential. What job do I take? Where am I going to live? Important decisions about parenting, for example. And the way I see decision science is as a way to try and think about all of those choices we make in a common framework. So are there kind of common principles that we use to make decisions, and what might they be? And can we use these principles to help people make better decisions? And this can be individual people, informing them as to how a better way of making a choice, or different types of evidence they might want to consider when making these, of course, important choices, but also thinking about government decisions and policy decisions. So can we usefully inform these bigger entities as to how they should take into account the way people decide in implementing policy to hopefully benefit all of us?
And later on, we will get to talk about some of the more specifics. We'll be touching a little bit about your research on unfairness and how we can harness that knowledge for public policy, for public good. Before we get into that, so our listeners would have heard at the beginning that you are not only the co-host of this podcast, but you are a professor of decision neuroscience. You are also the director of the Radboud Center for Decision Science, which this podcast is one initiative coming out of that center. So to help also give people a bit of an understanding about your research and how it's now led to a center, what exactly is the Radboud Center for Decision Science and what is its mission?
So to be really effective at conducting decision science, we need input from many, many fields with their different methods they use to assess how people make choices, but also their different theoretical frameworks and viewpoints. So the first goal of the Center for Decision Science was to try and build more what we might call interdisciplinary research. That is research that takes into account all of these different factors and tries to build better understanding of how we make choices. The second reason for setting up the Decision Science Center was not this internal view I've just given, but also to look a bit externally. So often this knowledge doesn't really disseminate to the outside world. And I feel, of course, we're doing a lot of research on decision making. People make all of these decisions. So it would be useful if we could take the knowledge that we've uncovered, both myself, but also more broadly as a field, and try and use this for some common good. And so the second goal of the Radboud Center for Decision Science is to try and provide a platform essentially for distributing the knowledge we have on how people make decisions to interested outside entities. And say, to give one example of this, and again, maybe to put this in a historical context, typically decision making has been thought of as largely rational. So the economic model of decision making has been what's called the rational actor theory, or rational actor approach, which is essentially saying that we as people make rational choices. Now, maybe it's just me, but this doesn't seem to resemble any process I go through when making a particular choice. It feels much more chaotic and based on a particular bias or the mood I might be in on a particular day, or a certain piece of information I just happen to come across. And so fields like psychology and neuroscience have been busy constructing different kinds of models of decision making that are much more constrained by how we act as people. We're emotional beings, we're limited in our cognitive abilities. We don't have perfect memory, we don't have perfect attention, we're susceptible to many kind of biases. And so we've tried to build models of decision making that are a bit more realistic. And one reason for doing this is because the existing policies are often based on this rational actor theory that I just mentioned. Kind of assume that if the government gives people the correct incentives, they will behave properly. That if we reward people for recycling and we fine people who don't recycle, that people will adjust their behavior accordingly and we get the desired outcome. And one thing we know from both many years of our laboratory studies, but also now increasingly the applied studies, is that this doesn't usually work, at least on the aggregate. It works for some people, but other people, it doesn't work at all. So some people will be perfectly okay saying, I'm willing to pay a fine not to recycle. It's worth my while to pay an extra €3 if I don't have to go through all of the hassle of recycling. So people will kind of game the system in that respect. And you end up often with outcomes that are not ideal. So in the rewarding people for recycling example, some people then also feel they're only recycling for the financial reward. So this is what's called crowding out motivations. That is the positive motivation. We might feel that we're doing our bit for the environment, but recycling gets pushed away and we turn out to be only doing it for the money. So this is just a cartoon example of how standard approaches to decision making can lead to these unintended consequences and not the behavior that we're actually trying to see in the people in question. And so what we'd like to do as part of the Center for Decision Science is try and make government and other interested entities, NGOs, for example, aware of what are the real ways people decide and how can we then implement policy effectively to achieve some societal good. So for example, how do we get people to recycle if we're not just going to reward them and fine them monetarily?
Right, and that's extremely helpful to hear that. And this podcast, as we mentioned at the beginning, is kind of an initiative that tries to get a little bit at those two goals. So the listeners of the podcast will hear over the next few episodes some amazing guests that are members of our center, friends of the center that are doing diverse work, interdisciplinary work, from science that has a bearing on decision making and trying to share that with people. So that's something exciting to look forward to over the next few episodes. I'm always quite interested in, while we're talking about choices, we're talking about decisions. There were obviously a lot of decisions that you took that got you to your point now. So what was it about the science of decision making that you thought to be really a valuable area to study?
Well, we have a saying in psychology that we all study our deficits. And so one thing I always found quite difficult was making decisions. I always found it hard to get to a point where I felt I had enough evidence to either go one way or the other, and I would carefully consider things. That's always been a personal trait, and I was always in somewhat awe of people who could immediately decide to do things without any second guessing. So I've always been interested in that kind of mental process of how we choose. How I came to study it professionally is a not very well thought out path, but it really came because when I left high school, I was a coder for many years, and in the evening I took night classes, and we had the option of doing either a computer science degree or an economics degree. I was already doing computer science by day, so I thought I'd try economics, and I found economics quite interesting, but it always seemed really bizarre, this rational actor approach I mentioned. We were always taught this is the way people decide, and this just didn't seem to tally in any way with everything I saw around me. And so I was interested then in that difference between the what you might call the psychological and the economic. And I decided then that the psychological was probably the most realistic and the most interesting one to study. So I took off to university to study psychology, specifically interested in these kind of cognitive models of human behavior. So how can we understand how the mind and the brain work? And at the time, there was not much talk of decision-making in psychology, with the exception of two guys called Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who were researchers, psychologists, who were interested in judgment and decision-making, and had these amazing little brain teaser problems, which were incredibly compelling and which showed up people to be the flawed choosers they often are. So they would ask people questions like, of all the words in the English language, do more begin with the letter K or have K as the third letter? And this seems like a very easy question for a native English speaker. And indeed, everybody overwhelmingly says more words start with the letter K than have K as the third letter. And everyone is overwhelmingly incorrect, because it turns out it's about 3 times as many words have K as the third letter than at the beginning. And this always kind of intrigued me. Then they have a whole series of these beautiful little problems which demonstrate that people's immediate, intuitive, and often very confident answer is invariably wrong. And so that really got me thinking about this whole idea of how do we know when we make a good decision? How do we know when we're collecting all the information correctly? And there's a rather small subfield of psychology is focused on these kind of questions of how do we make decisions and choices. And to me, that really just seemed, that's what we're about as people, is making these. So I just became very interested in studying that in greater detail. And can we really understand the mechanisms and processes that go into these, both the trivial decisions about what words start with the letter K, but also really important decisions that we're often faced with.
And could you maybe, for those that are listening, we could maybe think of our choices as individual choices and social choices or social decisions. And a lot of your research focuses on the social decisions. Can you just disentangle those two a little bit and help us understand the type of decisions that you are studying?
Sure. So most of the field of decision-making traditionally has studied what we might call an individual decision. And this is a decision where in order to make the right choice, I need to think about kind of what's good for me. I need to think about the pros, the cons, but it's essentially this decision is only in my head. So the example we often give is you're making you want to buy something, right? You need a new pair of shoes. And so off you trot to the store, and you have some number of choices in front of you, pairs of shoes. You have some budget. You have your own personal preferences, and your job is simply to maximize your preference and hopefully minimize the amount of money you spend. So in a sense, it's really just you and your own preferences. And I think for a long time, this was, I would say, 95% of the decisions that we studied in the lab, because they're nice and easy to study. We can give people nice little websites of shoes, or we can give people risks and gambles. But it's also became apparent to, well, other people, and then also to me, that these are some of the decisions we make, but a lot of the decisions we make are much more nebulous in character, in that they involve what we call social motivation, so that they involve other people, but they also involve our interaction with other people. So decisions involving how do we distribute things between people, right? children, and often goodies like chocolate has to be distributed amongst children. And then there's many questions about, does the oldest get more because he's bigger, or should it be split 50-50 because that's fair? And these are cases where I have to make a decision, and the inputs to me are much more social in nature. So we have to consider things like fairness and justice in our chocolate dividing example, but other factors like cooperation, like trust, like betrayal. These are all largely social constructions. They exist because of the interaction between people. And I think these are just a really fascinating set of decisions to study. And the more, of course, we study them, the more we see them. And even if we go back to our shoe example, there's also social factors here, right? I also presumably am thinking, I want to buy a pair of shoes that people will think I'm, a certain way. They'll think I'm trendy, or they'll think I'm, careful, or whatever. So there's these other factors that even impede on these, what we once thought were purely individual decisions. So these social choices are individual decisions plus, and that plus is really the essence of all of these factors that make our social world interesting.
Perhaps let's go into one specific aspect or one specific social decision that you have made quite a major contribution to the field, and that is your research looking into unfairness, specifically how our experience of unfairness can play a really important role in our decision making. And this is a really fascinating aspect for various reasons. Well, one, we can probably all say at some point that we've had a feeling or a sense of being treated unfairly. We perhaps have also seen through the news how other people respond to injustice or inequality. So can you tell us, through just a brief overview, what exactly have you studied in the context of unfairness, and how have you studied it?
So you're right that I find this really fascinating. One thing I find fascinating is people's sensitivity to unfairness. People are highly sensitive to being treated unfairly. Anger and frustration that's conjured up when we feel things have not gone our way and it's not right. And so we've been interested in this again because it's kind of difficult to study psychologically, but it's very powerful. And we're both interested in what leads to that feeling of unfairness. Is it pure, I'm not getting 50%? Is it just anything that's unequal is unfair? It turns out it's not that simple. We're okay with unequal divisions, but there has to be a good reason for it. So what are these good reasons that people might think? So that's one aspect, is what generates the feeling of unfairness. And then the second aspect is, what do people do afterwards? And we're constantly surprised with how annoyed people will get in our experiments when they're deprived of, €1 or €2, really small amounts of money, and everyone's aware it's a small amount of money, but nonetheless, it does create this strong feeling. And I think other than making for fun experiments for us, I think it's actually quite important, because I think certainly a lot of conflict in the world is driven by the feeling of injustice, right? We've been, as a group or as a country, we feel we've been treated badly and we've been treated unfairly, and now it's time to kind of object to that. We saw, not too long ago, when there was the financial crisis, there was a big upheaval against bankers' bonuses and bankers' financial remuneration, where people felt it's just not fair. These bankers have got us into this terrible situation, and they're not being, fairly punished. So we see it all around. We see it a lot. Sports is always a nice example for me. I like sports, and we can see unfairness everywhere we look. If we have the right colored glasses on, we see bad refereeing decisions, and we see terrible coaching mistakes. And it's very easy to get a whole group of people extremely irate when they feel that the referee has unfairly made a decision against them. So our challenge has been, then, can we generate some broad principles from a scientific perspective, which would be interesting, but then also, how might this impact policy? So if a government proposes a certain policy, perhaps tax policy, that people will feel unjustly treated, and perhaps this is something to avoid in terms of a policy implementation.
And so you study this in the lab, like you said. You also do work, though, studying it in terms of our brain, what exactly is happening in the brain. Can you say a little bit more about why that knowledge is useful, in addition to just knowing how people respond and their behavior? Why is that extra information really helpful?
Yeah, so I said a little while ago that our goal is really to try and build a better model, a model of decision making that goes beyond this rational actor that we think isn't a good representation of how people decide. And in order to do that, I think we need this model to be as realistic as possible. And obviously all our decisions essentially emanate from the brain. The brain is the primary constraint, physical constraint on our decision-making process. So I just think it's really important that those constraints are baked into the models we have. And so the models that we try and build, us and others, are informed by the specific processing of the brain and the specific brain areas that seem to be involved in decision-making. So for example, in the unfairness examples I was referring to, we'd see what happens in people's brains when they're treated unfairly. So we can put people in a situation that they're reliably going to feel annoyed and angry and unjustly treated, and we can see kind of what the brain processes look like. And one interesting area that we find fairly consistently across all of our studies is a brain region called the anterior insula. It's not one of the most popular brain regions, but it's a very important one. And one reason we find this interesting when it fires as a response to unfairness is because we had always thought of the insula as a very low level, what we might call somatosensory part of the brain. That is, it responds if you're in pain, if you're hungry, it responds if you're thirsty. So it's always been seen to respond to what you might call very low level physical stimulation, right? Very basic emotional aspects. But we also see it respond now when people are treated unfairly, which is quite a different category of negative emotion, right? Much what we might call higher level, more of a moral emotion than a physical emotion, which gives us some more insight into how the processing might be occurring at the brain, and again helps us build more accurate models.
Right, so looking at this both from behavioral and brain level, you just get a deeper understanding of our conception of fairness and how people are responding, and that information is really useful when you're thinking about the world. One aspect that I think is also really fascinating that you've studied is the flexibility of our sense of fairness. So we would probably all like to think that we have a really strong, firm moral core, but your research has actually shown that that's not quite the case. And so your research shows that there's a huge role to be played by context. So you're not only studying people's decisions, but you're studying how context could also influence that. And that's particularly relevant in society where different contexts could impact different people. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, a bit more about how our fairness principles might not be as firm as we might think?
Well, you're exactly right. Context turns out to be hugely important. And as you say, that's very relevant for any of the kind of policy implementations we might want to think about. So it turns out we all like to think of ourselves as having strong moral backbone and that we draw a line in the sand. And, this principle means that we won't take unfairness from anybody, and likewise won't inflict unfairness on people. And that turns out to be not entirely correct in two aspects. One is the me versus others. So we're particularly, of course, incensed when we are unfairly treated. When something bad happens to us and injustice happens to us, that really inflames us and leads to both this emotional response I just outlined, and then also to often very punitive action we take on others. So we really like to punish other people who treat us badly. And we really get a lot of satisfaction from punishing people who've treated us badly. We don't have nearly the same response, of course, when we witness unfair things happening to other people. So if we're witnessing a terrible footballing injustice, it's usually moderately amusing to us as opposed to, terribly infuriating. So there's that distinction between unfairness when it happens to us and unfairness when it happens to others. And then there's also, as you mentioned, very strong contextual effects. So what is unfair can be quite different as a function of the specific context. So as an example, we often study this using simple money division games. So Sarah, you get some money and you have to split it between yourself and myself. We all have a rough idea about what's fair. It's usually that 50-50 is usually considered fair. But if we shift around the context and, I tell you, despite my exalted professor status, I tell you by miserable salary and my large amount of children, you might feel sorry for me. And so you might be willing to share more with me. In that case, that's considered fair also. So there's many, many factors, and we're only really starting to identify these now. So now we're busily now building all the context back in and seeing which contexts shift their preferences for fairness and unfairness in certain ways.
So if we were to think about some takeaway messages from your research, both for the average listener And for those that are thinking about larger societal problems, I wanted to get your kind of thoughts on that. So for the average listener, what are some key takeaways from your research? What are some things that you think they should consider, or maybe the next time they feel unjustly treated, maybe bear in mind?
So one very helpful feature to stop people making unwise decisions as a consequence of feeling unfairly treated is simply to take some time. So in our studies, we've done some variants where people are simply told they cannot respond for 10 seconds. And even in that 10-second period, a lot of that immediate anger kind of fades away. So the next time somebody cuts you off in traffic and you feel that's not right, and you feel the urge to, ride up their tail for the rest of the journey, it's always worth taking a deep breath and trying to put it in the context of, is this really that important? So time is a useful healer there, trying to step away from the immediate situation and saying, how would it feel if I was the other side of this? Would I be able to justify this treatment, which is often the case? And also an awareness that this is a very primary and, in some sense, primitive reaction. We see it in, there's lots of really interesting studies on monkeys, and they show very similar behavior. So it's a very kind of primary response. The other piece of advice would be not make the situation worse by reacting in such a way as to throw petrol on the flames. But it is difficult, and I think a better understanding of why we feel unfairly treated and when we feel unfairly treated can help us with being able to take the appropriate action and not the extreme reaction.
Exactly. And so this is a really great decision tip for people out there, no matter what field you might be in, is that, like Alan said, maybe stepping back and thinking about the bigger picture could be a really helpful way to think about when you are responding to injustice. And this is coming from knowledge that we've derived from research, that people do respond in similar ways, and they do have this reaction to injustice. So it is not unusual to feel that way, but how you respond could help.
Yeah.
For people that now are thinking about this in a bit of a larger scale, so do you think we can harness this knowledge about unfairness to react or to respond to some of the societal problems that we're facing? For example, racial inequality or inequality economically. How do you think that this knowledge can be used in terms of society?
Well, I think the understanding that we often don't feel the extent of the injustice when it's not happening to us is useful. And so, for example, with racial equality or economic inequality, if we can try and take the perspective of the people who are on the rough side of the inequality, that can be very helpful in trying to foster a sense of broad knowledge about this. I think there's also a scope for taking advantage of the fact that we have a strong response to inequality, and using that in situations where there are social problems that maybe we're a bit lax about addressing. And so there's a movement within the environmental community to focus on the economic injustice of the climate issue at the moment. The fact that often it's people in developing countries who are really going to suffer the worst as sea levels rise and large swathes of countries become too hot and uninhabitable, and that's just not fair. And I think that has been proved that it's quite successful, that rather than making economic arguments, or rather than saying, in 50 years, these glaciers will be gone and so on, but to say that already some people are suffering because of our actions today. And the more, the more meat we eat, and the more we fly, and the more CO2 we produce, has direct effects now already on people who are, in a sense, being unjustly suffering for our gains. So I think approaches like that could actually be quite useful, and trying to make people realize it's not fair, and then using the indignation that often accompanies this feeling of unfairness to try and then, take some useful reparative action.
Right. So again, like you mentioned, that this is useful not only for people, but to think about larger term problems. And again, gives a practical and good example of where you could see an interaction between people in research and those people really on the ground in policy or in practice that are trying to combat these kind of questions. So through this episode, we've been speaking about decision science. We've been speaking about the Radboud Center for Decision Science, and a very practical example of research that you have done. I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on how you see this all combining. What would be your ideal vision for this field in the future?
So I think my ideal vision would be we just see more and more collaborative work that we focus on the problems. And at the moment, we focus as academics and as researchers, we focus on understanding the mechanisms, say. So we want to understand what happens when I feel unfair. So what leads to that? What do I do? And I would like to see a slightly shifted focus towards the problem. So we, at the Center for Decision Science, we've outlined 6 impact areas that we would like to work on. And these are largely defined by societal problems. So, for example, environmental sustainability as one example, and social equality as a second example. So I would like to see the research kind of coalesce around these problems. So how can our research help with environmental sustainability as it pertains to decision making? It's to try and put our knowledge to use. And I think we're start to be in a good position to do that. There's also a lot of enthusiasm around, I think, academics to do more applied research and also to work together. It's actually also a lot of fun and quite informative to learn from, people in law faculty or people in sociologists or economists. So working together on the common goal, I think we also know from other research, people do like to cooperate. Cooperation is a very positive effect on people. So I'd like to see more cooperation around these societal problems. And hopefully the Center for Decision Science will help us at least here move towards there. And maybe this will become a useful direction for the field to head.
Exactly. And like we mentioned already, that over the next few episodes, we'll be speaking to a lot of diverse guests, a lot of people from different fields approaching maybe similar topics, but from very different angles. And that kind of helps to get this mission and this future that we are hoping to get through decision science. So it has been such a pleasure to speak to you today, Alan. Before we leave, if people are interested to know more about you, more about your work, where can they find you?
Well, Sarah, they can find us at the Decision Center at the Center for Decision Science .nl. And in terms of my own lab, you can find me at decisionneurosciencelab.com. And there we have a list of our recent projects and some of our academic papers and also some of our outreach activities.